Some of the craziest assumptions people have made about Linus Torvalds leaving and the new code of conduct. Plus, Google. Their new version of Chrome recently introduced a forced login feature that violates user privacy. What's that all about? Firefox recently introduced a new monitor program that allows you to learn if you've been a part of a website data breach. Plus 22 things to do after installing Linux Mint. And I ask the broader question, is Linux still not as user-friendly as it should be? New releases. Fedora, WLinux, and Vivaldi all saw big releases this week. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. And the first story on the docket tonight is, the news about Linus Torvalds leaving and the new code of conduct, several days ago. That sparked a lot of outrage on the internet, a lot of debate, and quite frankly, a lot of wild-ass guessing and a lot of assumptions people were making. Assumptions that were not based on fact in any way. So now that we've had a few days to come down to earth and be level-headed human beings again, I'm going to show you this article here written by Stephen J. Von Nichols over at ZDNet. Linus Torvalds and the Linux Code of Conduct, 7 myths debunked. So here are 7 myths that Stephen J. Von Nichols wants to debunk. Myth number 1. The Linux kernel has been taken over by social justice warriors, SJW. And he mentions hardly. The new code of conduct is based on Coraline Ada Imke's Contributor Covenant version 1.4. It's been adopted by many open source projects such as Eclipse, Ruby, Kubernetes. So Coraline Ada Imke, she is in fact a social justice warrior. She is very political. She is very out there pushing the social justice warrior agenda. Imke is a transgendered woman who, again, is very political in nature, but Imke does not have anything to do with the kernel development team. She is not associated with Linux in any way. She was not asked to write this code of conduct specifically for Linux. This is something she wrote a while back, and because it's such a short and to-the-point code of conduct and kind of straightforward, it has been adopted by many open source projects, as Stephen J. Von Nichols writes. It has actually been adopted by over 40,000 open source projects. So are all those projects, have they been taken over by, quote, social justice warriors because they adopted this particular code of conduct just because of who it happened to have been written by? No, that's just silly. The code of conduct isn't really controversial. Anybody that reads that code of conduct, there's nothing really controversial about it. Now, you can debate on whether some of the language in it is a little ambiguous or whatnot, but nobody is going to say that code of conduct is, your project has been taken over by social justice warriors because of that particular code of conduct. So that is a little bit ridiculous. Also, who adopted the code of conduct in the first place? Ultimately, it was Linus Torvalds and the senior kernel developers. They were the ones that decided, this is the code of conduct we're going with, we need one, this is the one we're going with. Ultimately, according to Theodore So, who is one of the senior Linux kernel developers, and he's also a Google engineer, he explained this on the mailing list, that the Technical Advisory Board, the Linux Technical Advisory Board, makes a recommendation about the code of conduct, but the decision to act on that recommendation resides with the maintainers in general, and ultimately, Linus. So ultimately, this is Linus's decision as far as the code of conduct, right? Do you think Linus Torvalds was twisted or manipulated by SJWs, the social justice warriors? No. Do you think Linus Torvalds himself is a social justice warrior? I highly doubt it. So, myth number 1 really completely debunked. Myth number 2, Linus Torvalds left and then adopted the code of conduct to get ahead of the New Yorker article about him discouraging women from working on the kernel. So the New Yorker magazine, was working on an article right before Linus left about Linus's behavior and how he treated certain people, treated women in particular, and that was about the time Linus announced that he was going to leave the kernel temporarily, maybe, and work on his behavior. Did the New Yorker article basically force him to leave? No. It might have played a factor, according to Stephen J. Von Nichols. It probably did play a factor a little bit in his decision if he was already thinking about leaving anyway. But did the New Yorker article about his behavior force him out? No, because the New Yorker, that article was not going to shed light on anything we didn't already know about Linus. Everything he says pretty much is out in the public. Most of this happens on the Linux kernel mailing list, all his crazy outbursts and derogatory statements. That's been out there for 30 years. That the New Yorker article wasn't going to really shed light on anything new. So the New Yorker article was not what made Linus leave. Ultimately, the decision for Linus to take a break was Linus's. So, myth 3, nothing is going to change. And this one, I'm not sure if I agree with Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols or not, but anyway, myth 3, nothing is going to change. He writes, personally, I think the code of conduct in and of itself won't make much of a difference. I agree there. I believe you can't legislate morality. I agree there. What Torvalds does when he gets back will make the difference. I agree there. He has always set the Linux kernel community's tone, and he will again. Yeah, I guess so. I'm not sure if he really sets the tone. I mean, Linus is who Linus is, but I'm not sure if all those other senior kernel developers, they don't really emulate Linus as far, they really don't imitate his behavior. So, but is nothing going to change? I would say for the most part, yeah, the code of conduct is not really going to affect anything. Myth number 4, Linus won't change, or Linus can't change. Now, this is one I have stated that I don't think people can change, at least fundamentally, essentially change. And a lot of people took issue when I said Linus is always going to be the same Linus, he can't change, and people told me, well, that's not true, people change. I used to be a drug addict, now I'm not. I used to do this, and now I'm not. Yeah, but that's just things that you stopped doing. Fundamentally, essentially, you're still the same person, right? Linus may come back, and, he may not publicly chastise and belittle people anymore, at least on the kernel mailing list, but that doesn't mean Linus is essentially a different person, right? He's still essentially Linus Torvalds. That's all I meant when people don't really change. You're always who you are. Anyway, Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols thinks Linus will change. So I disagree with him there. In any case, he should be given a chance. Okay, I agree there. I have no problems with Linus Torvalds as far as, I actually respect him. I actually respect that he's stepping away to work on his behavior. And when he comes back, I hope it works out for him. And if it doesn't, well, that's fine too. I'm not that invested in this. So myth 5, purges of Linux kernel developers have begun. No, there's no sign of anybody having to leave the kernel development team. Nobody's left in outrage. Nobody has been pushed out. So anybody saying that Linux kernel developers are leaving, that's just a flat-out lie. At least as of right now, that is a complete and total lie. All right, myth number 6. Developers are leaving Linux and taking their code with them. No, again, they're not leaving, and you cannot take your code with you. This is one of the strangest kind of conspiracy theories going around the internet. First of all, there was this article over here at lulz.com. This was written by Eric S. Raymond, ESR, very famous open source guy. Also, Richard Stallman has commented on this too, that anybody that is written for an open source project licensed under the GPL can just rescind their code. They can take back their commits, and the Linux kernel can no longer use the code you contributed. No. That is, in fact, complete and total horse hockey. You cannot rescind your code. Once you push a commit and you've contributed this code to a GPL project, it is out there forever to be used. You can, of course, delete it if you want to from the project, but guess what? They can just put it back in. They have every right, because you have already put that out there, and it's licensed under the GPL. It's free for everyone to use. There is also the story at Grok Law. I will post this comment from a lawyer who says, in fact, yeah, you cannot, the guy claiming that you can revoke the GPL license on his code, here is the answer to your question. No, one can't retroactively revoke licenses previously granted, unless the license terms allow you to do so. The most you can do is stop granting new license. So yes, you can't retroactively now go back and say, no, I don't want to be a part of the GPL licensing that I was a part of before. You cannot just take back your code. So, and his 7th myth that Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols wanted to debunk is Linus is never coming back. Okay, Okay, he says Linus is coming back. I'm not sure how he knows for sure Linus is coming back. I mean, Linus says it's a temporary break. I'm sure that's what he's thinking. He's coming back, but who knows? I mean, that's kind of... Are you Nostradamus, Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols? He might take a break and then later decide, you know what, I like not working on the kernel anymore. I'm not coming back. He may become ill. I mean, there's all kinds of things that could happen to prevent Linus from coming back. So saying Linus for sure is coming back, I think that's wishful thinking. I think we all want him to come back, but I don't know about that one, Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols. One other thing, talking about the ridiculous things I've seen on the internet, I just saw this morning over on Reddit. Idea: what if Richard Stallman and his lieutenants fork the Linux kernel right now and really make it GNU/Linux? Yeah. And the second story on the docket tonight is the story about Google Chrome. Their recent version 69 has caused a lot of controversy in the past few days because they introduced basically a forced login feature that many users are complaining violates user privacy, and Google has taken a lot of flack over this in the past few days. So this article that I'm going to show you is from TechCrunch. This article written by Zach Whittaker, and of course I will link the article in the description. Security experts say Chrome 69's forced login feature violates user privacy. So basically there's a new feature in the latest version of Google Chrome that logs users into the browser when you sign in to any of the Google services, any kind of Google site. So we're talking about things like the search, YouTube, Gmail, any of those Google services. You log into them. You're also now logging into the browser. So it logs users into the browser anytime they log into a Google site of any kind. So until recently, that was basically your choice to log into the browser or not. Now you no longer have that choice. It is default. It is really forced upon you. You really don't have an option to not do this. So this change, reading a little bit from the article here, this change has left users unclear why the feature was pushed on them in the first place. Many security folks have already panned the move as unwanted behavior, arguing it violates their privacy. Absolutely. This is absolutely a violation of your privacy. But again, Google is not the best in terms of privacy. I mean, let's be honest. Also, Google Chrome, their browser, is proprietary software. This is not free and open source software. This is what happens, unfortunately, sometimes when you use proprietary solutions. So, if you value your privacy, you probably want to be on a free and open browser. Some users had good reasons not to want to be logged into Chrome, the article continues, but now Chrome seems to take that decision away from the user. And the article goes on. There's a cryptography professor from Johns Hopkins who reboot the move in a blog post over the weekend, arguing that the new forced login feature blurs the strong barrier between never logged in and logged in. So, I mean, this has people really up in arms. There's been a lot of complaints on Twitter. And Google, to their credit, since they got a lot of backlash the last couple of days, came out and said, you know what, we're going to rethink this. So Google is now going to give Chrome users an opt-out to the forced login after this privacy backlash. So Google has responded to blowback about the privacy hostile change it made this week. And they're going to say that in a forthcoming update, which will be Chrome 70, which is due mid next month, you will now have the option to opt out of the forced login. So it's still there. It's still on by default, but you can turn it off. That's really not responding to this. I mean, most users are not even going to know that this was ever an issue. I mean, your typical computer user, your typical web user, they're not even going to know that all this stuff is going on in the background. So from a privacy standpoint, this really needs to be turned off by default. If somebody wants to turn it on, let them, but that does not appear to be the case. It doesn't appear Google is interested in that. Anyway, I'm going to link to both articles, the article about Chrome 69 introducing the feature and the article also from TechCrunch about in the next version, Chrome 70, that they will make this a opt-out. And the third story on the docket tonight is another browser-related story. This is going to be a very browser heavy show this episode of taking into account. So Firefox has recently introduced a new service called Firefox Monitor, which helps you learn if you've been part of one of these online data breaches. So this comes from the Mozilla blog. This was written by Nick Wynn. Says, introducing Firefox Monitor, helping people take control after a data breach. Data breaches, when information like your username and password are stolen from a website you use, are an unfortunate part of life on the internet today. Unfortunately, that is correct. If you've been on the internet more than a few months, chances are you have been part of some kind of website data breach of some kind. You've had username, passwords, and emails and everything, personal information stolen because people have, unfortunately, breached some kind of website and hacked their way into something and stole all the information, usually part of a database. Ooh, hear a train blowing. That's unfortunate. And continuing on, now that the train has passed, I live about a quarter of a mile from a railroad track, unfortunately, and sometimes it comes through blowing that horn, and normally it doesn't pick up on the mic, but I'm not sure, that was pretty loud. Anyway, so Firefox Monitor. How do you sign up for this? How do you get this going? Well, you visit monitor.firefox.com is the name of the website. And then it asks, well, there's a couple of things you can do. First, you can try it out. You can enter an email for a basic scan. So I will enter this email because it's been made public on the channel many times. I've given you guys my email here, derek@distrotube.com. And we scan, and it says, so far so good, your account did not appear in our basic scan. So them not having my email and, one of their databases means I'm all good, right? I haven't been breached in any way. That's good news. But data breaches can happen anytime, and there is still more you can do. Subscribe to Firefox Monitor for a full report, alerts when new breaches happen, and tips on protecting your passwords. Do I want to sign up? I just click sign up, and I'm good to go. Or I can scan more email addresses. Many of us have multiple email addresses. So anyway, that is how you get signed up. Monitor.firefox.com. Let me get back to the blog. Anyway, you visit that, and through their partnership with Troy Hunt's Have I Been Pwned, HIBP, your email address will then be scanned against a database that serves as a library of data breaches. We'll let you know if your email or personal information was involved in a publicly known past data breach. Yada, yada, yada. Anyway, step 2, sign up for the Firefox Monitor using your email address. You get notified about your breaches. Now, the next question most people are going to have is, how is this going to be handled? As far as I'm giving you my email address, it's in this database. How are you going to protect my email address, Firefox? How are you handling my privacy? And that is a good question. Firefox, they actually do have another blog post over at the Mozilla Security blog, basically telling you how they handle all of your personal data as far as regarding the Firefox Monitor service. The service will use anonymized range query API endpoints from HIBP, Have I Been Pwned. So anyway, it discusses things like anonymizing account identifiers, anonymized data sharing, even shows some code anyway. How they protect against brute force attacks, so nobody can just brute force their way into this database that has everybody's email, as far as Firefox Monitor. Anyway, I'll link to both the security blog on how they're handling your privacy, and of course the announcement from the Mozilla blog about Firefox Monitor. And the fourth story on the docket tonight is 22 things to do after installing Linux Mint. And this will apply to most every Linux distribution. And the reason this is interesting, let me go ahead and pull up this article here. So over at Frostbites, 22 things to do after installing Linux Mint 19. And this article was just posted a couple of days ago, even though Linux Mint 19 has been out for a couple of months. But you get a lot of these kind of articles, especially regarding things like Linux Mint and Ubuntu. This is a recurring topic. Okay, you're brand new to Linux, so you're probably using something like Ubuntu or Mint. Here are a list of 15, 20, 50 things to do after you first install your brand new, Linux Mint install. And what struck me about this is, I've seen these kind of articles many times, but what struck me is how still, even though Linux Mint is probably one of the most user-friendly Linux distributions out there, the fact that there's still 22 things you need to do after installing Linux Mint, and some of them are not that user-friendly. So keep that in mind as we go through the list of things to do after installing Mint 19. This would also be things to do after installing things like Ubuntu 18.04, any of the various flavors or other, user-friendly Linux distributions out there. So they mentioned the welcome screen is the first thing. It can be a helpful tool to get things up and running. Many Linux distributions now have this welcome screen or a greeter of some kind. Mint does it. I know Ubuntu Mate has a very nice welcome screen, but basically familiarize yourself with everything about the project, the distro you're running, and Linux in general. That's nice, but do you really need to do that on other operating systems? Does Windows and Mac have basically a welcome screen that links you to documentation and basically instructs you that it might be a good idea to read up on Windows and Mac before you use it? No. I love the welcome screen idea, but, even throwing that up in front of a new user can be kind of daunting, kind of a scary thing. It's like, hey, you know what? You really need to read up on some stuff before you run this because, this is not as easy as you think. Anyway, check for updates. Now, check for updates is simple enough on most distros. In Ubuntu and Ubuntu-based distros and Linux Mint, there's a update manager. Even on things like Manjaro, they have Pamac and Octopi and things like that. The update process in Linux has become very easy, but still it is not as user-friendly as something like Windows, which Windows does these automatic updates for the most part. You don't have to go do them yourself. You certainly don't have to type anything in a terminal. They even give a terminal command you can type on, Debian and Debian-based distros, sudo apt update, sudo apt upgrade. So even that is not as user-friendly as something like Windows and Mac, but you know what? That's not that bad. Checking for updates. It mentions optimizing your update servers on Linux Mint. Now, this is getting, again, a little bit more complicated. So this involves opening your update manager, going to software sources, and then to mirrors, and then editing the mirror list. Of course, you could do all this in something like Nano or Vim. In the terminal, you could edit your sources list. That is a little technical. Most new users would never want to play around with something like that. For installing your missing graphics drivers. Now, this is a big one here. Linux Mint might not be a go-to OS for gamers. Nevertheless, installing the latest graphics drivers is one of the first things you should do after installing Ubuntu or any other distribution. So, your NVIDIA proprietary graphics drivers. I have an NVIDIA card. Guess what? The proprietary graphics drivers are not installed by default. You have to install them yourself. Now, Ubuntu and its derivatives make this easy because there is a little driver manager tool that comes up, and you just click on the driver you want. You want the proprietary driver, not the open source driver, and you click apply changes. But still, again, for like most computer novices, think about, your grandmother running something like this. She's not going to know that those drivers are not even activated. She's going to run the Nouveau drivers forever because she's not even going to know that the proprietary graphics drivers were never enabled. And even if you told her how to do this, she probably wouldn't do this as far as enabling the proprietary graphics drivers. Wouldn't it be great if that was just installed and running out of the box on most Linux distributions? It's not, and the reason it's not is it's based on principle. They don't want to ship anything that is non-free software. For most Linux distributions, they won't ship anything that's non-free software out of the box by default. That's why you have to go and turn on the NVIDIA proprietary graphics drivers. It pulls them down from the internet and installs them after you click apply changes, but they're not actually on the ISO. Anyway, so that's something we really need to work on. The next one is another one. Install the complete multimedia support. So this is all your multimedia codecs. This is another one. It should just be by default. It's not, because these multimedia codecs, again, are not free software. It mentions how you install them in Mint. Sudo apt get install Mint meta codecs. You have to open up a terminal, enter that. There's some ways you could do it, I'm sure, without the terminal. I think there's an option in the installer to get these out of the box. But anyway, Microsoft fonts are not installed by default on many Linux systems. That's another big deal. A lot of people that are used to how the web looks from a Windows machine, when they first sit down to an Ubuntu machine or a Mint machine and go to the web and they see that the fonts on all their favorite websites don't look anything like they used to look, it's because most of those fonts are Microsoft fonts. They are things like Arial and Times and Georgia, Comic Sans. You have to go and install a package called TTF MS Core Fonts in Ubuntu or Mint to get all those fonts installed on your system. So when you go and visit the web, all your websites, they look like they did back when you ran Windows. All the fonts are correct. Again, this is not as user-friendly as it should be. And I just went through 6 of these. Just quickly, I'm going to spat off most of the rest here. Install some useful software. So a lot of software that you might want. It includes all the proprietary software that are not installed by default on the ISO because they're not free software. Things like Chrome, things like Skype, Dropbox. Create a system snapshot. So backing up your system, most users are not going to do that. And again, it's kind of an advanced thing. Disable startup applications. Most new users are not going to do that. Optimize your swap usage. That is definitely not something most people will do. Use the Synaptic Package Manager. That's not a bad option, even for new users. Configure your firewall. Remove Mono and Orco. Configure Power Manager. Improve battery by adding this PPA, then running an update, then installing TLP. Well, that's nice and all, but again, we're getting more advanced stuff using snaps and flatpaks. Anyway, I'll link to this article, 22 important things to do after installing Linux Mint 19, but I do ask the question. Even as what many people tout as the most user-friendly Linux distribution out there, Linux Mint, having to do all that after you do an install, are we still not as user-friendly as we should be as far as an operating system? Because to potential new Linux users coming from Windows or Mac, much of what I just said will scare the hell out of them. And I really think the Linux community, we still have a long way to go as far as correcting some of these and make this a little bit more palatable to the new user. And the 5th and final story on the docket tonight is the new releases this week. And this will be interesting because the new releases this week, I didn't include all free and open source software this week. I actually included some proprietary stuff in here, which is unusual for me, but I think one of the projects here deserves it, even though it is not free and open source software. But let's start with free and open source. Fedora 29 beta is now available. So Fedora 29 is due out shortly. I think the official release is due out in about a month. They're going to have a feature freeze, I think, the second week of October for Fedora 29. Anyway, the beta is out. Reading a little bit from the release announcement here, we're pleased to announce that Fedora 29, the latest version of the Fedora operating system, is now available in beta. The Fedora project is a global community that works together, yada yada yada. Anyway, anything important of note here works better on ARM devices, so those of you running things like Raspberry Pi might be interested in some of what's going on, but really not much posted here in the release announcement. Anyway, so Fedora 29 beta is out. Also recently released, there is a new Linux distro specifically designed for Windows, and it is in the Microsoft Store. So you guys have all heard about the Windows subsystem for Linux, and how you can get certain Linux operating systems working on this Windows subsystem for Linux. You can install them from the Microsoft Store, things like Ubuntu, SUSE, I think Debian's in there. Anyway, reading a little bit of this article, nearly every Linux distro is available in the Microsoft Store, allowing developers to use Linux scripting and other tools in the WSL. Now another distro has popped up in the store, and unlike the others, it claims to be specifically optimized for WSL, meaning a smaller and more appropriate package with sane defaults helps developers to get up and running faster. So unlike things like Ubuntu and SUSE and Debian that have their images, in the software Microsoft Store, This particular distro was designed with the Windows subsystem for Linux in mind. That's the only place that was designed to run. This particular distro, by the way, is called WLinux. It is based on Debian. The developer is Whitewater Foundry. They claim that their custom distro will allow faster patching of security and compatibility issues that appear from time to time between upstream distros and WSL. Anyway, it has a feature list. It says fast Linux terminal and development environment for you developers out there. It has all your development tools such as Git, Python 3, etc. Out-of-the-box support for most Linux graphical apps with no need to configure display or libgl settings. That's cool. And anyway, I will link to this particular article announcing WLinux. Also, not free and open source software. This is proprietary software. Vivaldi 2.0. And again, more browser news. But I have been really impressed with Vivaldi over the last couple of years. It is a really nice browser. I wish it was open source software. It's not. It is proprietary, but they seem to be doing things right. Today's update, it includes sync, resizable tab tiling, floating web panels, and over 1,500 improvements since the first version of Vivaldi. Take control of your most important application, the browser, with the most powerful version of Vivaldi yet. Anyway, I will link, of course, to this article, and it includes a change log and many screenshots. Vivaldi is such an attractive browser. Vivaldi is based on the same web engine that Chromium uses, so I often use Vivaldi even though I'm a Firefox user. I often do install Vivaldi on my systems for those times when I have to use Google Hangouts. Occasionally, somebody will want to do some kind of video chat with me, and they want to use Hangouts. That's all they know. And Hangouts does not work really in Firefox, and I don't want to install Google Chrome. I don't want any part of their browser. But Vivaldi 2.0, Hangouts works great in that, so I often install Vivaldi on my system. Really nice browser. Again, I wish it was open source, but for proprietary software, it's not bad. So I give some proprietary software some love today. And that was the fifth and final story on the docket tonight. So that was Taking Into Account episode 10. Taking Into Account is a weekly show. I try to release a new episode of Taking Into Account every Thursday. So normally, other than the 5 main stories I cover, I usually do a viewer comment or question. To end the show, I read a viewer comment and question. I'm not going to do that this week because I am going to do a comment from myself to end the show this week. I want to do just a quick announcement in that I plan on taking a little bit of a break from the channel. I'm going to take a little bit of a vacation, a few days. So actually, right after I finish editing this video and posting this video, I'm going to take a week's vacation. I've been needing some downtime, some time for myself because I've just been really overworking myself a little bit. I'm starting to feel it, tired and just not in a good mood most of the time. So I need time from my real job. I also need time from this job. I put in a lot of hours on this YouTube channel. So I'm going to take a few days. I think I'm going to take a week. So you're going to get Taking Into Account episode 10 today, this Thursday. You will get Taking Into Account episode 11 next Thursday. But in that week between episode 10 and episode 11, you might not get anything else on the channel. I'm going to make it a point. I'm going to try not to do anything on the channel. That's going to be hard for me because I typically work all the time. I'm a workaholic, but I'm going to make it a point not to step anywhere near YouTube for the next week. The only thing I'm going to make an exception for, I've been doing a live chat every Sunday morning. I've been doing one of these free and open chats every Sunday morning. And I may still do that because it's something easy. I don't have to do any kind of video editing because it's a live stream on YouTube. I just sit there, record for a couple hours, and when I'm done, it's done. So I may still do that, but any of my pre-recorded shows, no distro reviews, no Linux tutorials of any kind for the next week. So you get this episode today, this Thursday. Next Thursday, I'll be back Taking Into Account episode 11, and then things will be rolling again. But I'm going to take a few days. I hope you guys understand. If you guys want to, contact me, feel free. Especially you guys that are following me over on Mastodon. That's usually the best place to talk to me if you want a response. YouTube, I try to respond to all you guys on the YouTube comments too, but I get hundreds of YouTube comments a day. It's kind of hard to keep up with all those. Of course, I'm not going to be able to respond to all those, especially as I take a break, I'm not going to be sitting at this computer much either for the next week. So I'm going to try to, get out and do some fun stuff for the next week. Anyway, hope you guys understand. Before I go, of course, I do need to give a special thanks to my patrons. This show was made possible by Ansem, Carlos, David, Leor, and Rob. These guys, they're the producers of the show, my highest tiered Patreon followers. Really appreciate those guys. This show is also brought to you by, you see the fine ladies and gentlemen on the screen, their names. This show would not be possible without each and every one of those folks. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel. Support DistroTube over on Patreon. Peace, guys.